What we find is, when we study hundreds, thousands of lives, is that it's actually investing in your relationships with other people that is the most likely thing to make you happy.
Welcome to Commune. We are on a mission to inspire, heal, and bring the world closer together. Robert Waldinger, welcome to the Commune podcast. What a treat. Great to be with you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So first off, congratulations on the launch of your recent book, The Good Life. I was only imagining the conversation you had with your publisher when they asked you, who is this book for? And, I was like, well, anyone that wants to be happy.
Yeah, really. And I've never written that kind of book before. I've only written academic things before. So this was a wonderful stepping out of my usual silo.
Yeah, it was very enjoyable. And there's many stories to follow in there, aside from very, very interesting data and findings. And, of course, everyone has a stake in this question: what makes a good life? So I'm hopeful that across the course of our conversation, we can slowly back into the key determinants of a good life. But before we dive in, I want to divulge a little serendipity, which I think you'll find interesting, and it may color our conversation slightly. So my wife, Skylar, her grandfather is a man named Ellsworth Grant. And I was both of us were very, very close to him. We spent significant chunks of the summer with him for 25, 30 years, and eventually cared for him through hospice in, I think it was like 2013, like 10 years ago, when he was 95. So he was born in West Hartford, Connecticut in 1918 and matriculated at Harvard College.
I thought I knew that name, actually. I was wondering, where do I know that? And now, yeah.
So for every couple of years, particularly as he got older, Skylar and I would help him fill out paperwork and various surveys associated with the study. So,
oh no! And that's our worst nightmare, that other people fill out the surveys. Although we're glad you helped him, but yeah,
no, we didn't provide any answers. Okay. We just kind of helped him get the paperwork sorted and whatnot. And he was very, very dedicated to it. So not to get ahead of ourselves, but I wanted to divulge that serendipity because I thought it was interesting. And of course, you are the current and I believe fourth director of this study.
That's
so
right.
Perhaps as a means for scaffolding our conversation generally, can you describe the Harvard study of adult development?
Sure. So it began actually in 1938, as you said, and it began as two studies originally that didn't even know about each other. One started at Harvard College, and that's where your wife's grandfather was, right? And that consisted of 268 young men, 19-year-old sophomores, who their deans thought were fine, upstanding young specimens. And it was meant to be a study of thriving. It was meant to be a study of normal development from adolescence to young adulthood. So, of course, if you want to study normal development, you study all white men from Harvard, right? I mean, it's now so politically incorrect. And we're constantly having to explain to NIH why they still want to fund us. But at that time, they wanted to study what they thought were the best and the brightest for the conditions of well-being. And then the other study at the same time, 1938, was started by Sheldon Gluck, who was a Harvard Law School professor, and Eleanor Gluck, his wife, who was a social worker. They were interested in juvenile delinquency, and particularly in how children from some of the most disadvantaged families managed to thrive and stay on good developmental paths, stay out of trouble, even though they were born into such disadvantage. So there were 456 boys, average age 12, who came into the study in 1938 as well.
Wow. So you've had the luxury of kind of looking after what I believe is like the longest longitudinal and also prospective study, which provides, I think, greater insight, really ever on human happiness. Is that right?
That's right. As far as we know, it's the longest study of any kind of depth for that many years.
And it's really amazing because, since that time, we've become more accustomed to kind of the human potential movement, for example, or positive psychology, like in the 90s and 2000s, like Martin Seligman, or even going back to even Abraham Maslow, who was somewhat contemporaneous with the study, but I think his hierarchy of needs were maybe more like 40s and 50s. Yeah. And then there's like Norman Vincent Peale and like Power of Positive Thinking, but that's kind of more in the 50s. So this study was really before its time, because at that juncture, we really have largely associated human psychology with this concept of like what's wrong with people.
Yes.
And very Freudian in that sense. So you talk a little bit about kind of how unique this was in and of its historical context.
Right. That the way research evolved was out of medicine, and psychology evolved alongside and out of medicine. And basically, medicine concerns itself with suffering and relieving suffering, relieving illness. So the studies were about what goes wrong in human development as a way to try to develop means of helping people. So, but it was radical to say, okay, what goes right? And that's what we did. And as you say, it was before much of these other endeavors to look at thriving and what's positive in development. So, and my predecessor was unusual in that he really wanted to study how development happens across adulthood. Most of what we know and most of what we study is child development, because kids change so rapidly, so dramatically, and everybody thinks of that as the thing that needs the most attention. But we used to think that, when you got to your 20s, you were kind of done. You were who you were going to be, and that was it. Well, now, you're chuckling and I chuckle because, my gosh, I mean, how different are we from when we were in our 20s, right? So much development and change happens over the adult lifespan. So I think this field of adult psychological development and social development is one that's relatively unexplored and very rich.
Yeah, so true. And, now in the last kind of 20 years, with these emerging fields of epigenetics and like neuroplasticity, these ideas that really point to this, the idea that we're not fixed,
right?
That we're a constant interaction with the inputs of our environment. And as you say, even after the age of 25, there's still the ability to evolve and to learn. I mean, I just learned how to play jazz piano starting at the age of 46.
Yay!
So
yeah,
very, very amateur, I will say, although I had my first gig recently. Sparsely attended, but that was good. I think there is, so much avenue for growth, particularly as we, you talk a lot about, curiosity and the importance of staying curious and being open to learning and not ossifying. And I think it's just kind of fascinating. I wonder if given that happiness has been the subject of so much analysis. I mean, the Greeks were obviously very consumed with notions of happiness, and Aristotle coined the term eudaimonia, which I know you use. I wonder if you have come to a good definition for human happiness.
Well, I always return to the research on it, which has come from, for example, Carol Riff and her work out of the University of Wisconsin. And the research shows that happiness falls into kind of two big buckets. One is what they call hedonic well-being. It's, am I having fun now, right? So you and I are having this conversation and I'm enjoying it. And so that's good. But that's a moment-to-moment experience. You know, an hour from now, something upsetting may happen and I won't feel that kind of hedonic happiness at that point, right? So up and down, often all day long. And then there's eudaimonia that you mentioned, which is that sense of life being worthwhile and having meaning. And what the research suggests is that all of us want some of both, but that some of us really prioritize hedonic well-being, the moment-to-moment happiness, and some of us prioritize the longer-term well-being. There's also a third that research is beginning to explore, a third kind of well-being called a psychologically rich life, that some people prioritize the richness of experience more than they prioritize long-term meaning or short-term happiness. It's like, I want to do exciting new things. I want to travel to new places. I want to try skydiving. I want to learn jazz piano, right? And it's not because it adds meaning to your life, and it's not even because it's fun all the time. I imagine learning jazz piano has some boredom to it. But it might be that for you, it makes life psychologically richer. And I know for me that psychological richness is something that I gravitate toward. So I think these three buckets of happiness are there for each of us to think about in terms of how much we prioritize and what we care about.
So interesting. Yeah, I mean, part of my kind of mild obsession with jazz piano is, you know, finding those brief moments in which I become the conduit for something greater. Flow state.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that idea of kind of yoking, I guess, intention and action, and how important that might be towards happiness?
Well, that flow state that you mentioned is really what many people find so nourishing, rewarding, fulfilling. And I'm a meditator, and sometimes that flow state is something that happens for me when I'm sitting on a cushion. I can't make it happen. It just happens. And then I'm just there, present, and I lose all sense of time. But the flow state could happen when you're playing piano, when you're skiing down a ski slope, when you're working in your garden, so many places. And so I think what we think is that the people who are most fulfilled in their lives often find some place where flow is likely to happen for them.
Yeah, so interesting. I mean, we are so preoccupied with discursive thought, right? So, and a lot of these experiences that you just described, you know, being in the garden or skiing down well, in California, I think they've got like 50 feet of powder.
Oh my gosh.
It's something crazy. They really point to cognitive absence in a way. It's almost letting go of thoughts kind of arising and subsiding in consciousness moment to moment.
Yeah, I mean, what my teaching in Zen has been is that thoughts they're not the enemy, right? They're not to be extinguished or pushed away, that our minds are going to produce thoughts as long as we're alive, but that, you know, as you say, kind of letting go, not letting them be the whole thing, but letting thoughts just kind of be there, but then taking in everything else. And there's so much more to our life than what goes on in our little minds, the thought loops that we go through. And so to let yourself be present for all the sensations, sounds, sights, you know, that come to us, that reach us every moment, that's part of the flow state. where we're not just simply lost in the discursive mind.
Yeah. There was a paper that I started poking at, I think was written by maybe Dan Gilbert, and I think maybe Killingsworth
Yes.
was the co-writer.
Yes.
I think it was called A Wandering Mind is an Unhappy Mind.
Yep. Yep.
So there's so much opportunity to be distracted, particularly with pings and dings coming from every single direction, kind of in this attention economy and persuasion economy. Can you talk about that idea? Why is a wandering mind an unhappy mind?
Well, what Matt Killingsworth found when he asked people, he would ping them. It's called ecological momentary assessment, where you ask people moment to moment, like they have beepers, or you ping them on their phones and say, is your mind wandering now, or are you present to what you're doing? And what's your mood like? How happy are you in this moment? And that's how he found that when people said their minds were wandering, they reported that their moods were also less happy. And when they found, when people reported that they were focused on what they were doing, their moods were happier. So that's how he got that association. And we don't know why that is. We just know that it is. And therefore, the more we can train the mind so that we have the capacity to be present when we want to, the more we have some control over our mood and over our well-being. That's what we find. And that's why, one of the reasons why we think meditation has those benefits to mood, because it allows us to focus when we want to.
Yeah, there was a curious piece of it too, which is that, like you said, thoughts are not the enemy. Thoughts will naturally, arise and subside in consciousness. And even if you have a kind of single point of focus, it's quite natural to kind of drift off that focus momentarily. But the suggestion was that the people that had refined the skill to be able to return to the drishti, the gaze point, the breath, the mantra, whatever the tool was, the people that had that skill to return back to that from distraction tended to be the people that had most self-reported well-being.
Yeah.
So I was very curious.
And that's really what meditation is. It's when your mind carries you off, and our minds do it all the time, and when you remember coming back to something in the present. It could be open awareness, it could be a mantra, it could be the breath, it could be sounds, anything, but just coming back to the present. And that coming back to the present, it constitutes a little moment of awakening. And for some reason, that has wonderful benefits for mood and the sense of well-being.
And is that how you would describe the experience of Zazen? And maybe you could take a moment to kind of unpack what Zen meditation is like for you and your journey toward it.
Gee, I never dreamed I would become a Zen practitioner. Never, let alone a Zen teacher. Like, I'm a Jewish kid from Des Moines, Iowa. Like, I was not supposed to be doing this. And I found myself drawn to meditation, that once I tried it and once I was exposed to Buddhist philosophy, so many things began to make more sense and feel right to me. And then eventually I found a teacher and a group to sit with. And the experience in Zen is quite particular. There are many different forms of meditation, many different ways to teach meditation. Zen focuses primarily on the breath as an object of meditation, and then gradually, at times, letting go of that focus and simply being present for whatever reaches your awareness. So it could be the breath, but also sounds and sensations and thoughts. But it's always coming back to the present. And Zen is an interesting practice for me because it has no stages of meditation. Zen, the famous mantra in Zen is, there is nothing to attain. There's no place to reach. There are no levels. There's no place to arrive at. That we're already Buddha. We're already enlightened. We just don't recognize it until we do this practice. So what that means is that you don't aim towards something particular. You simply sit and watch your mind and come back to the present over and over and over again. That's the lifelong practice of Zazen.
Yeah, and it's so funny because oftentimes meditation gets packaged for its benefits.
Yeah.
You know, so it'll lead to optimal performance or better levels of concentration, or you know, cortical thickness, or you know, lower cortisol levels, or all of these things. And it's very, very easy to connect to it for its future benefits.
Yeah.
But once you're doing that, you've almost lost the point a little bit, which is funny.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's what one of my teachers called the great bait and switch of Zen. So we come to it for that, right? I came to it because I just wanted to relax and I wanted less stress in my life. And then I sat down on a cushion and my mind went wild. And actually, it was very stressful. But I found it quite nourishing, and I found gradually I would calm down, but not because I could make myself do it. There was nothing I could go after and grab onto in Zen. And so the bait is you'll feel better, you'll get this relaxation or whatever you're after. The switch is then you realize, oh no, I'm just here to watch my big, messy heart and mind show me what's there. You know, show me what's coming up moment after moment.
Is there an element of, well, in Sanskrit, it's upekkha or equanimity that often gets associated with like Vipassana practice, for example, where, you know, what you're really doing is cultivating kind of these moments of sacred, non-judgmental presence. Does that also apply to Zen, this notion of equanimity and non-judgmental presence?
Well, Zen says we don't cultivate anything. We simply let it unfold. So the idea is that you can get to a point where you realize, oh my gosh, I am judging myself and the world every 5 seconds. You know, and after you watch your mind do this over and over again, eventually you begin to see past it and say, oh, wow, what happens if I let this go? Right. And so it is a natural evolving rather than I got to stop judging here. Right. Right. Similarly with equanimity, that equanimity is a wonderful side effect of meditation. I can't make myself feel equanimous. But boy, sometimes I get there by accident. And so, you know, one of the teachings, you know, in my tradition is that equanimity, enlightenment are accidents, but you can make yourself more accident prone.
I love that. That's great. You know, it's so simple to, I think, or so common, I should say, to fall into the trap of fixating on the trauma of our past and then project it into the future as I can't remember if this is from Daniel Kahneman or not, but as anticipated negative memories. So we're almost creating negative memories in the future by focusing on the past. And of course, when we're doing that, we're not here now.
Right.
And that seems to be such a central component to happiness.
There's a great Mark Twain quote. He said, some of the worst things in my life never happened. And, you know, he's talking about that so phenomenon of taking, you know, first of all the stories we tell ourselves about everything that's wrong. And yes, there is real trauma, and it's, you know, and so I don't want to discount that at all, but that carrying those stories and having them seem like our destiny, that is where we lose our life, right? And that one of the things we find, and the stories in the book of our participants really illustrate this, is that your childhood doesn't have to be your destiny. That there's room for lots of corrective experience in our lives, particularly in relationships, as we find good ones, that can correct for some of the worst things that have happened to us in our childhoods.
Yeah. And I also don't want to discount real trauma-inducing events, neglect and racism and abuse, and how we carry that forward. Peter Levine calls it the tyranny of the past.
Yeah.
And that's real, and really requires a tremendous amount of work and to confront. And now we're kind of experiencing all these breakthroughs in psychedelic therapy and ketamine assisted therapy, along with talk therapy. And I really feel like we're at this precipice of hope and optimism in that field, and in how we relate to our trauma. But, at the same time, and I just know this because I'm very familiar with the stories that I tell myself about myself,
Yeah.
is that, every experience of the past, memories, if you will, happen in the present moment.
Right.
And we have a tendency to tell ourselves the same stories about ourselves that perpetuate negative cycles of suffering. And our memory is very mangy, I would say.
Oh, yeah.
that memories often are used to comport a vision of oneself at the moment, and might deviate significantly from the actual original event itself. And Alan Watts actually has a wonderful sort of image around this notion of present and past. We sort of instinctually think that the past, through cause and effect, creates the present, but he uses the analogy, or the visual analogy, of a ship. The ship actually creates the wake behind it. And so the present is actually creating the past in this way.
Yeah.
And I wonder kind of if you've had any thoughts around that, of how we can free ourselves from the negative stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves.
Probably the best way to free ourselves is through attention. Often people come to me. I do psychotherapy. I see therapy patients every day in my role as a psychiatrist. And people will come with stories about themselves. Like, I am, so many negative things that they tell themselves, that I'm this kind of person and I'm wrong in this way. And one of the things that I find can be helpful is asking them simply to pay meticulous attention to how other people encounter them and how other people behave toward them. And often they're surprised, because when they really look, people don't treat them like they're horrible human beings. They don't treat them like they're disgusting. They don't treat them like they're all the names that people call themselves. In fact, they, a patient will come in and say to me, they treat me like I'm kind of a normal person, and like they're glad to be in this meeting with me. And so I keep saying, okay, we're going to keep going back. You're just going to keep looking. Just keep looking at how other people encounter you, as one way to understand how you're showing up in the world. And that can go some distance to softening the intensity of those negative stories that we tell ourselves.
Yeah. I know that, well, I don't know this, but I intuit this because of your work and your writing, that you also have an interest in Stoicism. And of course, Stoicism was also very preoccupied with this idea of eudaimonia and happiness through virtue, wisdom, justice, moderation, courage. I think of the principle for virtues in Stoicism, but also there is one of the bedrocks of Stoicism is focusing on the things that are within your control as a means to achieve greater happiness. Can you talk a little bit about why that's important?
Well, much is not in our control. And boy, the more I practice Zen, the more I come to see the reality that so much is not in our control. And so paying attention to what you can control is really helpful. The idea that, well, if you're worried about something, you ask, can I have any effect on this outcome? And if the answer is yes, then you can do something about it. If the answer is no, then worry is not going to help. And that to try to frame things in those ways can really ease some of the optional suffering that we layer on to our lives. There is suffering that we can't get out of, lots of it in human life. But then there's the optional suffering, like worrying about things that we can't control, that might never happen. I've spent lots of time worrying about things that might never happen. And so coming back to that Stoicist principle of paying attention, okay, what really can I control right now, helps me to reorient, to reset, and to get out of my worried mind.
Yeah, there's a couple quotes that I won't attempt to summon from Epictetus or maybe Marcus Aurelius. So many good ones, but that point to this idea that our emotional states are often reflections of our kind of knee-jerk judgments about particular events, and not really related to the underlying event itself. And so we, especially, in a 24-hour news cycle, right? So a lot of us have biases around certain things. And before we even actually have unpacked anything to do with the actual event itself, we're in a state of outrage because we have reacted to our judgment about something instead of the actual thing itself. And I guess this also kind of speaks to that being able to find that non-judgmental presence in yourself.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm curious, as we kind of delve into the sources or the provenance of happiness, what do people generally believe will make them happy?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, the classic tropes, money's going to make me happy. Fame is going to make me happy. Achievement, getting lots of awards, that's going to make me happy. And we see it everywhere. And, when you ask young people what they're going to want to do with their lives, what they're going to prioritize, they list those things. Like the majority of them list money, fame, high achievement as the things they're going to need, to have a good life. And yet, by contrast, the UN does a World Happiness Report every year, and you can get it online, and you can get the executive summary because the actual report is reams of pages of a PDF. But every year they do a survey all around the world, and they ask people, well, what are the key elements that you need to have a happy life? And they don't include wealth, fame, or high achievement. They do include getting your basic financial needs met, for shelter and clothing and food and healthcare, all that. But once you get your basic needs met, as you know from Daniel Kahneman's work, then earning a lot more money doesn't really have such a great payoff. And so what we find is that the culture sells us. We sell each other these myths about what's going to make us happy. And think about the messages we get all day long. I mean, buy this car and your life is going to be more exciting. Serve this brand of pasta to your family and your family dinners are going to be blissful, right? And so we're constantly given these messages. And yet truly what we find is, when we study hundreds, thousands of lives, is that it's actually investing in your relationships with other people that is the most likely thing to make you happy.
Yeah, well, we're going to get there and unpack that in hopefully some great length. Certainly I can just speak from my own experience, is that the moment that you cut the ribbon off the new car, let's say, you're already focused on some other glittering object on the horizon. Absolutely. Right? So this is the hedonic treadmill in action. And I know, Daniel Kahneman, I believe in 2010 had that study that seemed to point that to at least, once you've had your basic needs taken care of, and I think he can put that threshold at like $75,000. Yeah. Now maybe adjust for some inflation in the era of inflation, but has that held up? I mean, I know that there has been certain, other studies that seem to suggest that, money does play a bigger role. And I'm sure a lot of people could point to, well, you could buy better food, or, you can hire more babysitters or free up more time, et cetera. I wonder, what role did you find, at least in your study, that correlates money and happiness?
Well, I love that you're asking about this now, because just this week, there was a new article published. So Daniel Kahneman and Matt Killingsworth did I think they're calling it an adversarial collaboration, because they disagreed. Matt Killingsworth published an article saying, no, wait, your happiness does go up after you make $75,000. It keeps going up. And so Kahneman suggested that they collaborate and figure out, okay, what can we discern about which it is? And what they seem to have found is that it depends. That if you start out unhappy, then your happiness doesn't keep going up as you make more money. If you start out on the happy end of things, then your happiness keeps going up. So in terms of happiness, the rich get richer because they get a happiness boost as they make more money. But the take-home message for me of this newer research is that if you are looking to wealth to remedy your unhappiness, don't look there, because it's not going to do that.
The take home for me is that two people who disagree can effectively work together.
Wasn't that great?
That's anachronistic to our time.
Absolutely.
I think that's great. Certainly, like I look at my own life, and I started from somewhat humble beginnings, but as we've become a little bit more able to satisfy our basic needs, the idea of like planning trips with my family, for example, even the planning part is actually as fun as the actual experiential part. Yeah. So it's almost the opportunities for creativity that some degree of disposable income, opens up. But
it's true. And, they've done studies that ask the question, well, with your disposable income, if you have some, are you happier if you buy material things or if you pay for experiences like a vacation? And what it shows is that that you are happier, and you are happier for longer if you pay for experiences than if you pay for material objects. Experiences could be anything from tickets to a basketball game to a vacation and material objects are like, this flat screen TV that's here behind me. And they've actually studied the reason. And the reason seems to be that material objects lend themselves to comparison. They just beg us to compare with other people. Yeah. And we know that the more you compare yourself to other people, the less happy you are. And that experiences can't be is easily compared. I mean, my vacation isn't going to be the same as your vacation, even if we go to the same place. My going to the basketball game with my son isn't going to be the same as yours. So that means that we don't compare as instinctively, and we get closer often to people we care about when we have experiences together.
Yeah, that is a fantastic point. I mean, there's the oft said quote, I think it's a Teddy Roosevelt quote, I'm not sure, but that comparison is the invisible thief of joy.
Yes, and I love that quote.
And we live in an era where you just can't help almost to compare, particularly, in the era of social media. I have 3 teenage daughters.
Right.
And, they're scrolling through sort of fake images of perfection, unattainable fake images of perfection, and then feeling that pressure to match that fake image of perfection with their own fake perfection.
Exactly. And often feeling they can't match it, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
This is the greatest non-consensual psychological experiment of our time.
Exactly.
Right now.
There is some research that you may know about how we use social media and that it makes a difference in our well-being. So the research seems to show that using social media passively in the way that you're describing, where we scroll through somebody else's Instagram feed and look at their curated lives, that lowers well-being because of this comparison, that it raises levels of depression and anxiety, it lowers self-esteem. But that if we use social media to actively connect with other people, it can boost well-being. So the example is a friend of mine during the COVID lockdown reconnected with his elementary school friends, and they've started having coffee on Zoom every Sunday morning, and they're just thrilled. Like, they compare notes about things that happened in the 3rd grade, and they're just tickled pink by this new found set of reconnections. So the bottom line is that the research is pointing to active connection on social media making us happier, passive scrolling, consumption making us less happy.
Yeah, interesting. It's almost like the hedonic use of social media versus the eudaimonic use, if you think of it in terms of almost on a biochemical basis. So there's a hedonic usage where it's like, oh my God, I got 10,000 likes on that particular post, and I'm getting sort of a flood of dopamine motivation and reward. But of course, that quickly subsides, and then you're off to kind of find the next thing to post that hopefully will get more likes than that. And, you're kind of, again, on this treadmill. And that's very much kind of, pleasure-seeking, hedonic kind of dopamine harvesting. And then you're talking about, the other side, which is a more eudaimonic usage, which is actually less focused on pleasure and more focused on joy. And I suppose from sort of a neuromodulator biochemical point of view, more concomitant with like oxytocin or serotonin. So I wonder, kind of in your study, did you look at kind of some of the neurological biomarkers as it pertained to happiness?
No. What you just mentioned is like way above my pay grade. We didn't look at that.
Are you kidding? I doubt that.
But what we've used biomarkers. So we actually bring people into our lab and we deliberately stress them out. And then we watch how they recover from stress. And both, physiologically, and we ask them about their experiences. And so that's one way of trying to look at the biological reactivity of our systems and how we recover as a marker of well-being. That the idea is that people who are less reactive to stressors and who recover sooner are thought to be in higher states of well-being and certainly in better health physically.
Yeah, that's so interesting. And obviously that again speaks to Stoicism, that put a lot of importance on this notion of resiliency.
Mm.
and building our psychological immune systems by kind of disarming an insult, by just being unmoved by it, and being able to sort of recover from stressors. And actually, I wear this aura ring.
Oh,
That
yeah, I see
measures,
those around a lot.
yeah, well, they measure one of the biomarkers or metrics that they measure is heart rate variability,
Hmm.
which is this other metric that does indicate how your nervous system essentially bounces back
Yep.
to stress. So as you continue your study, maybe that will be a,
No, we
a
use
metric that you look
we
at.
use heart rate variability. That's one of the things we measure after we stress people out, during and
Okay,
after.
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. So as we're kind of hovering around this topic of health, what is the relationship between kind of good health and happiness?
Oh, well, it's a bidirectional relationship. So when our health
Yeah.
is good, we're more likely to be happier. We're more likely to be in a better mood. And we're in better mood. When we're in better moods, it's health promoting. We're less stressed. We have fewer circulating stress hormones, less chronic inflammation. So it works both ways. And it can set up both a virtuous cycle and a vicious cycle, depending on which way it's going.
Yeah, I find that the downward spiral is the one that I think we're most familiar with, where, you don't get a good night's sleep, and then you're grumpy and grouchy, and because you're tired, you don't get exercise, and then you don't eat well, and then you don't treat people particularly well.
Right.
And, that can be a downward spiral. But there's also upward spirals.
Yeah.
Where, if you start to adopt certain protocols, and, you can pay attention, and you get good sleep, and you take care of yourself, that can actually create kind of more effusiveness and efflorescence and generosity in your relationships. So yeah, these things are clearly very, very tied. So I feel like we're slowly getting into kind of what is the primary determinant for happiness and human flourishing. So we know that it's not really money. We know that health has something to do with it. Certainly, purpose in one's work. Viktor Frankl talked a lot about meaning and work. But in your research, what did you find to be the number one determinant for human happiness?
Yeah, it was relationships. It was the warmth and breadth of your connections with other people. And it wasn't just the determinant of happiness, it was the determinant of physical health. And that was actually the surprise. So, it stands to reason if I have good relationships, I'd be happier. That's not a surprise. But how could good relationships make it less likely that you'd get coronary artery disease, or more likely that you would live years longer? And that's what we found. And at first we didn't believe it. And then other research groups began to find the same thing. And then we began to understand that this is a very robust finding.
Wow. So are you suggesting that loneliness or isolation is more correlated, or is directly correlated, with certain forms of chronic disease?
Yes. So what they've demonstrated with good research is that people who are lonely, people who are isolated, have weakened immune systems. They have heightened cardiovascular reactivity. They have delayed wound healing. I mean, they did this very cool study where they did skin biopsies, punch biopsies on a group of people who were caring for demented relatives, and a group of people matched for age and health and everything else who were not doing that. And the people who were caring for demented relatives, their wounds took on average something like 39 days longer to heal. And so it's a very dramatic effect. What we know is these physical effects of isolation and loneliness are powerful.
So interesting. Yeah. I mean, certainly close personal social connections can alleviate stress, and the alleviation of stress can lower cortisol levels, for example. And high chronic cortisol levels are, I know, associated with depressed innate immune system. So people with high cortisol levels, for example, produce less neutrophils and macrophages and all these kind of innate immune cells. So, you know, you can really start to draw lines on a physiological basis to, you know, why loneliness might result in diabetes or coronary artery disease, et cetera. It's just fascinating. And I mean, obviously we're facing an epidemic of loneliness. You know, part of that, I think, is that we've really sanctified a society that is very focused on the individual and individual accomplishment and achievement, kind of at the expense of collective achievement.
Yeah.
But, you know, I look, you know, kind of just have my children and like how they're growing up, where, you know, often in front of screens, et cetera. And it is a source of a lot of concern, is that have we lost this ability to cultivate close relationships because we're sort of so removed from it. And obviously that was accelerated by COVID. So in your analysis of a lot of the Harvard study data, were you able to kind of untangle some of that data to show kind of specifically that folks with more social connections tended to report as happier?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And they were healthier. And what we found was that the people who were best at this were active in maintaining their social connections. And that's why we coined this phrase social fitness in the book. And because what we found was that it was really analogous to physical fitness, that the people who were best at this and therefore happiest and healthiest were the people who actively took care of their relationships as they went through their lives. So, you know, everybody was busy, you know, with jobs and family and lots of obligations, but there were people who regularly made sure they connected with friends and family members, regularly invited people over, joined clubs, attended houses of worship, did all kinds of community activities. And those people were those well-connected, happy, healthy folks in our study.
Yeah, I love that term, social fitness. It's immediately resonated with me as someone who tries to work on my physiological fitness. It's easy to go in and on some level and do some push-ups and pull-ups, and because it's very quantifiable and you can kind of make yourself do it. But I'm wondering, are there similar techniques for social fitness as there are for physiological fitness?
Well, there are. And the techniques are about repetition, about consistency. So what we find is that these are not Herculean efforts you have to make to stay socially fit. But it might mean when you're done listening to this podcast, think of somebody you sort of miss and you aren't as connected with as you'd like to be, and send them a text or send them an email or call them on the phone. You know, just do that. And if you did that with someone in your life once a day or even once a week, you would start noticing that your connections are stronger. You know, if you regularly make plans to go for walks or have coffee or do something with a friend, that those people will be more in your life and they will be more connected to you through those small, consistent actions. Sort of like, you don't just go to the gym once and say, good, I'm done. I did my workout. I don't ever have to do that again. Same with social fitness.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm wondering, Bob, did you find in your analysis that the dispositive factor was the number of overall connections or the number of actual very close connections that people had?
Well, as usual with human beings, it's complicated. So what we find is that, all of us are on a spectrum from being shy to being extroverted. And what that means is that we're going to vary a lot in how many people we need in our lives. So shy people need a lot of alone time, and they refuel by being alone. They might need just a few people in their lives. Extroverted people get their energy from others, and they need a lot of people in their lives. So it's really quite an individual matter. Like, how connected do you feel, and do you have enough of what you need? But what we do find in our study is that we think everybody needs what we call a securely attached relationship, meaning somebody who you feel will be there for you when the going gets tough, somebody who will have your back. At one point, we asked our original subjects, who could you call in the middle of the night if you were sick or scared? And most people could list several people in their lives, but some people couldn't list anyone. And some of those people were married and they couldn't list anyone. And we think that those people are the people who are in trouble, who are not connected in vital ways.
Yeah. Yeah. I suppose, loneliness can actually be a reflection of a loneliness with yourself, in a way where, that, we all crave a certain kind of belonging, in society where we can maintain our own authenticity and still be accepted. That's sort of kind of the delineation between fitting in and belonging. Sometimes as a young person, I grew up all over the world traveling and being toted around by my parents and having to learn new languages and go to new schools all the time. And I was always trying to fit in. I was willing to kind of chameleon myself to, to connect. And then, that was followed me through a lot of my adult life. And I always felt like, oh man, I've got to change myself in this particular situation to fit in, and then finally kind of came around. It's kind of a moment of personal satori of that there was a difference between fitting in and belonging.
Yeah.
And what I was really looking for is a community where I didn't have to sacrifice who I authentically was, who would just, accept me warts and all.
Yes.
I could just, show up tired and not my best self on a particular day and still be loved and hugged. But I think a lot of people have that same problem with themselves, where they've sort of invested a lot in the symbol that they have for themselves, which is, maybe the ego, which is kind of this stockpile of societal labels that you collect, and you're never good enough. You never feel like you're satisfactory, and in a way, that's a sort of a loneliness with yourself. And in some ways, I think you really have to address that in parallel with addressing your outward social connections, because I think those two forms of loneliness can often go hand in hand.
Well, and they're very much related. One of the things we did when our people got to be in their 80s, we asked them, looking back on your life, what are you proudest of and what do you regret the most? And one of the most common regrets was, I wish I hadn't spent so much time worrying about what other people thought. And there was that sense of, I didn't let myself be myself, my authentic self. It's hard to do, as you're saying, especially, if like in your situation, you were in environments where to survive, at least emotionally, you needed to try to fit in. But at a certain point, we all need to say, what feels like me? I'm reminded of that wonderful Oscar Wilde quote. He said, be yourself. Everybody else is already taken. It's like you can get to a point where you say, okay, being somebody else, trying to fit in is just not a viable path.
That's right. Liking me is not your job, Bob. It's my job.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. So interesting. Kind of back to my wife's grandfather, Ellsworth, he lived until he was 95. And one of the real legacies that he was very, very committed to was family. And, we had this kind of funky old summer cottage that on the Connecticut shore that, wasn't winterized or anything, it was pretty, the deal. And very, very, very old school. And he was absolutely committed all the way up until his last year to spending, the summers there at this house. Yeah. And really all he wanted was to sort of be, particularly in the later years, was to be kind of propped up on the porch in a rocking chair. He didn't, and just to survey the scene. And I had young children and they were running around and, they would come up and kind of attend to him from time to time. And everyone called him Grandman. And, they would go in and get him a glass of lemonade and all that kind of stuff. And for him, that was the mark of success.
Yeah.
And, then on the other side, he also grew up and I'm wondering if you kind of found this phenomenon with other subjects. He grew up in this era, when he was born in 1918, he was part of sort of the greatest generation. And that generation, particularly of men, had a very hard time being emotive and affectionate. It just wasn't something that was kind of part of the culture then. And I know that if he had any regret, it was that he couldn't quite break through and like tell people that he loved them or, really like get affection with them. And I wonder if you found that was common and whether or not that's changed as society has changed.
Well, we have a story in the book about a man who was typical in that way. He thought he had a great life and he had, loved his kids, loved his wife. They had a good marriage. His kids and his wife kept saying, Dad, you never express anything about yourself. You never show us how you really feel about anything. And he began to understand that there was some way in which he was unable to connect. And for him, it was like, look, everything's fine. What's wrong here? And everybody else was saying, we miss you. We want more of you. And I think that kind of disconnect is something that may have been generational, particularly for men, depending on how they were raised, how they were socialized. Fortunately, I think men are being socialized differently now to see emotions as a sort of vital, central part of our lives and our relationships. But that generation, it was quite the norm to be buttoned up.
Yeah. Do you have kind of personal happiness practices? Obviously, you're a meditator, but have you been able to leverage in your own life what you have been able to glean from a lot of these studies?
Right. Do I practice what I preach? Right.
Well, wisdom is taking your own advice.
Yeah. Well, but it really did affect me. look, I'm a Harvard professor. I mean, I could work 24/7, and I was working a lot. And once my kids left home, my kids were a wonderful reason not to work all the time. And the thing I would do is I'd drop everything when my kids wanted to hang out with me because it was wonderful and it was rare and, precious. Mm-hmm. But when they left home, I realized that my default could just be working nonstop. And I began to understand that if I didn't do this active connecting that I talk about, that I was going to have nobody in my life. And so what I'm much more active about now is making sure I have plans. I have a walk planned with a friend tomorrow, another walk on Sunday. I've got people who I regularly have dinner with. I have a couple of people who I have breakfasts with, and so I've made it a point to make sure I do this. My co-author, Mark Schultz, and I have a regular phone call on Fridays. We've had it for 25 years. And yeah, we talk about our research and our writing together, but we also talk about our lives. And I find that those active connections are really important. So yes, I'm trying to keep taking my own medicine, but I have to do it every day, every week, as I'm saying.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, cultivating good relationships is very gratifying. And perhaps more challenging is actually repairing broken relationships.
Yeah.
So I wonder if you could just spend a moment talking about kind of forgiveness or how we go about repairing broken relationships and that relationship with happiness.
It's easy, especially when we talk in this way, for people to get the impression that, well, your relationships are supposed to be smooth and it's all supposed to be kumbaya all the time. And no relationship is like that. No relationship of any significance. There are always disagreements, disappointments. And what we know is that when people work out disagreements, relationships get better. They get stronger. Yeah. And so the key is not to have no disagreements or difficulties in your relationship, but to find ways to work through them together so that everybody comes out feeling like nobody's won or lost and everybody's gotten through it and you're going forward together. I mean, the other thing that my Zen practice helps me see is how often I sit there and say to myself, I want this person to be different from who he or she is, right? It's like, I mean, how often do I sit and watch a bird in a tree and say, oh, I want that bird to be a little different? No, I don't do that, right? So if we think about other people as just manifestations of life and different manifestations of life, then it's not about making anybody different. It's about being with and finding ways to work with the ways that we all are together, including the difficulties.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like thoughts arising in consciousness. You look at it, you witness it, and you come back to the breath. That these things are processes, that relationships that are good might take a bad turn, and it's your ability then to address those and forgive. I mean, we talk a lot about forgiveness as a gift, that you give to somebody else. But of course, we absolutely know from direct experience that it is the gift that you give yourself, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, the Buddha talks about kind of holding the ember of resentment and waiting for that moment to throw it, at someone who's wronged you,
right.
And, who's getting burned that whole time, right? So, but this is hard. I mean, I interviewed, I can't remember what his name was now. He's kind of from the University of Wisconsin. He's one of the most preeminent thinkers about forgiveness. And he, often would say, forgiveness can start in the head. We can understand that it's a gift that we give ourselves, and we can understand that forgiveness does not forsake accountability or justice, but to actually feel it in your heart is the next, challenge. Certainly I've had experiences in my own life or I've held resentment for way too long. And I was the one who was suffering.
Yep.
You know, I wasn't sleeping, I was gaining weight, and then I was, you know, probably drinking an extra glass of wine or two, and none of that led to a positive result. So, and then finally, you know, nirvana, blowing out, right?
Yeah.
You know, you let go.
Yeah.
And you can really benefit from that. So I wanted to ask you just another question or two. One about altruism and charity. Did you find any correlation between self-reported well-being and philanthropy?
Yes. That, you know, what we find, and many studies now find, is that people who broaden their sphere of concern to others and take care of others, you know, it could be through causes you care about, could be through mentoring people, could be raising your kids, so many ways, but concern beyond the self and the small sphere of me and mine, that those people feel more that eudaimonic well-being. They feel like my life matters, my life is worthwhile, and that those people are happier. You know, Erik Erikson talked about generativity, and we found that the people who were most generative, particularly from midlife onward, were the people who felt the greatest contentment with their lives and felt the best about themselves.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess I hadn't thought about this before, but I wonder if you found this phenomenon. I mean, and this idea is very baked into, like, Hinduism, for example. They have the ashramas, so different stages of life. You know, you brahmacharya, you're the student, and then you're kind of the householder, and, you know, you're raising your children and making your mark in society. And then you literally become, in Hinduism, a forest dweller. I think is the, and kind of on your way to being a sannyasin or a sage. And then, you know, this is an idea that Carl Jung wrote a lot about in terms of the second half of life is sort of the pursuit of the true self, and you've already established your ego, etc. Do you think happiness is more associated with the second half of life as you become more, I guess, spiritually mature in some ways?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer to that, but I can tell you that we get happier as we get older. So literally, as a species, our mood on average gets better as we get older. And it's documentable from about the mid-40s on.
Really?
Yeah. There's an investigator at Stanford, Laura Carstensen, who does a lot of work on what she has called the positivity effect, where essentially what we know is that the mind's bias when we're younger is toward the negative. Like, we notice and we remember what's negative out there. And we think that's adaptable for survival, you know, to scan the horizon. But then as we get older, that bias shifts toward a positivity bias, which means that we're more likely to remember and retain the positively valenced information that comes our way. And what that seems to have to do with is the awareness that life is finite and short, that instead of making us more depressed, it actually makes us prioritize well-being more and stop deferring gratification as much. So I can't say that it's because we gain greater wisdom, but there is this normal process that seems to move us toward paying more attention to what's positive in our lives as we get older.
Yeah, it's so interesting. You know, in Stoicism, there are kind of what's often considered negative visualizations. So there's a practice that I'm sure you're very familiar with called memento mori, which is sort of reflections on one's own mortality. And in Buddhism, I think it's maranasati, which is sort of a tradition of meditations focused on one's inevitable mortality. And, you know, at first those practices could appear kind of morbid, but actually, it's very much the contrary. It's what they do is that they invoke a feeling of gratitude for everything that you have right here, right now. And you become, more, I suppose, just kind of thankful and appreciative of even life's smallest gifts. So it's interesting, and then it's also really interesting that you point to sort of that our human negativity bias is associated with our biological imperative to survive, right? So that this, of course, was very adaptive on the Serengeti. Less adaptive maybe on the savannah of Facebook or whatever. But it seems to me that, as we age kind of in our early part of our life and through adolescence, and we label everything in our field of consciousness, and that starts in a very prosaic manner, like, there's a car and there's a bird or whatever when we're kids. But then as we get older, there's a person of a different political affiliation or a different sexual orientation or a different skin color or a different status in society. And as we do all of that labeling, we are inherently sort of labeling the self and building up kind of this kind of false understanding of who we are. And that's kind of the ego, if you will. And then, for me, at least, it was somewhere around 47, 48. All of a sudden, I had sort of a kind of spiritual awakening, and life became sort of a U-turn of shedding a lot of those cloaks of identity and a lot of those labels that I was giving myself kind of in relation to society and what society thought of me and how I was judged through the eyes of others. So, I think it's interesting, whether or not this idea, I'm fascinated by just the idea that we seem to improve our mood in the second half of life. Fascinating. Yeah. Cool. Well, I just love your curious mind, and I just found so much of the book really fascinating and obviously beautifully written and just peppered with really interesting stories that I think can give us a lot of insight into the good life. So very, very grateful for your work. Well, Robert Waldinger, thanks so much. The Good Life, Lessons from the World's Longest Scientific Study on Happiness. Thank you so much for your work.
Thank you for having me.
Hey, thanks for watching. If you like this interview from the Commune podcast, then click subscribe and check out this video right here.